So without further delay, I would like to bring forward our next speaker, Billy Hattaway, who is no stranger to helping to improve conditions for bicycling in Florida. And if you can allow me just to provide a little background on Billy's contribution. Billy Hattaway, PE, is the District Secretary for District 1 of the Florida Department of Transportation. For those of you not familiar with FDOT's district, it is one of the largest ones in southwest Florida, encompassing the area from Bartow all the way down to Fort Myers and points beyond. He has over 35 years of transportation and program management experience with FDOT, but in addition to his role as a district secretary, he has a much larger role in that Secretary Prasad hired him specifically to improve bicycle and pedestrian safety in Florida. So we really appreciate Billy's efforts in that area. Secretary Prasad hired him for a focused initiative to improve bicycle and pedestrian safety. He is also chair of Bike Walk Central Florida, a nonprofit organization dedicated to safety for pedestrians and bicyclists. He is a trained cycling savvy instructor, an avid cyclist who leads a 40-mile group ride every Saturday in Orlando, focused on creating goodwill with motorists riding safely and observing the laws. Billy? And you can use this microphone here. You can use one of these here. Thank you.
We'll try this out. Can you hear me in the back? In the very back. Very good. Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here. How many of you were at the celebration last year in DeLand at Stetson University? Okay, it's a fairly small number. That helps me to know what you've already heard and what you haven't heard, because this is somewhat of an update on the presentation that I made last year, although we've made a lot of progress in the year since I was here last. So as Tim mentioned, there were, as some of you may be familiar with, a report called Dangerous by Design. It's been put out by Smart Growth America. And every 3 years they've done this report, most recently in 2011 and then again here in 2014. And basically what the report said is that these 4 regions, which are really regions, so it's not the city of Orlando, it's Orange and Osceola County, just as an example, are the most dangerous places in the country for pedestrians and bicyclists. And that report, which came out in 2014, said the same thing. It's important to note that the 2014 report was based on 2012 data. I was hired in October 3 years ago, so I came on board in October. We really had just started our efforts in the spring of October, and I'll talk a little, in the spring of 2012, so that by the time that data was collected, we were just barely starting our initiative, which has been hundreds, if not thousands of hours of work on my part alone. So we've got a lot to do. But as Tim mentioned earlier, the agency has historically been nationally prominent in doing so many things. We've been a leader in so many areas. But one of the things the secretary said when he announced to the other 7 district secretaries is that this is a place we do not want to be number 1. And as he put it to them, he used me leading this initiative as a way to twist my arm to get me to come back to the department, because he knows, first of all, I'm a change agent. Secondly, he knows how important safety is to me. I was the state roadway design engineer for 6 years. Where I tried to move a lot of these initiatives forward back then, but our leadership just wasn't on board at the time. But he brought me back knowing that, and likewise he knows that I'm an avid cyclist and that this whole issue of safety is important. So that was one of the things he used to lure me to come back to the public sector after being gone for 10 years. When we first started the initiative, we knew that just working on those 5 regions wasn't going to get us there, because he wants to see the numbers coming down, as do I, for fatalities and crashes with pedestrians and bikes. So initially, we identified the 10 counties where we had the largest problem. And over the last year and a half, as we've been looking at the crash data in the corridors where we do have the greatest problems, we realized that there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the top 10 and the top 15. So since then, we've added 5 more counties to that list, again, with the idea that we've got to make this a statewide effort and a significant effort to get the numbers down. To cover basically about 2.5 years worth of effort here in 3 slides, I'll focus on the high points. The one thing that we had to do right from the beginning, when I came on board, I knew from having worked outside the agency and inside the agency that we really did not have adequate focus in our districts or at the statewide level on bike ped issues. Generally speaking, each of our 7 geographic districts had a bike ped coordinator position, but depending on that district, and most of them had that duty as an ancillary duty to some other primary responsibility, which meant it didn't get very much attention. It was not a primary responsibility, it was secondary to some other duties. And so one of the things I told the secretary is that we're going to have to rebuild this whole program statewide, both in the central office and in the district. So what I did is I was able to get him to back me in setting up in every district whose sole responsibility is bike ped for planning and design, which is the district bike ped coordinators. Likewise, in central office, we took that position. It was in safety. We put it in the Office of Design where it should have been for many, many years. And then we also had to address the safety issues. So in our safety office, we have a bike ped safety program manager. That's her full-time responsibilities. Her name is Trina McPherson, and she's like the Energizer bunny of program managers. This woman is fabulous. And we hired Dwayne Carver, who's our state bike ped coordinator in the Office of Design. Likewise, Dwayne's a cyclist and is a planner and knows this business inside and out. So we've probably got the best person we could find in both of those positions in the entire state in our agency. In each of the districts, we set up a bike ped safety program manager. They're in the safety office in traffic operations to deal with our existing safety problems that are out on our corridors where we have identified those corridors. And we now have GIS mapping that shows what we call our hotspots for crashes for pedestrians and bicyclists. And all that information is being used for the districts to go out and do road safety audits and then identify what measures that we've got to do to address those problems and get those crashes down. The 2 other groups I want to talk about is the bike ped policy team. In addition to dealing with the existing problems, we can't keep doing what we've been doing and expecting different results. So I lead the bike ped policy team with representatives from the appropriate offices in Tallahassee to change our planning and design guidance, which I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this will drive the change within our organization in terms of how we design our roads on the state system. And then the coalition is made up of our sister agencies and other organizations, the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles, the Department of Health, Economic Opportunity, the Florida Public Transit Association, the Florida Police Chiefs Association, and the Florida Association of Sheriffs to help us with a broad-based approach to dealing with this issue, not just from an engineering standpoint, but also education, enforcement, and actually changing our laws, and you'll see why here shortly. So how are we working on driving the culture change? You can't just make policy. You can't just make policy changes. You've got to implement the change. And so the way we're doing that, and I'm going to skip down to the 3rd bullet here, is primarily that we have adopted a complete streets policy. The agency last month adopted our first complete streets policy. And while a policy is great, it's only a starting point. Lots of people have policies. We're developing an implementation plan, and during this year, we'll be working to develop and implement that plan in terms of completely changing the way we do design and plan our corridors. And the approach that we're going to take is what we're calling a context-based approach. We have traditionally had a one-size-fits-all approach to designing our streets and highways. It didn't matter whether we were in a downtown or in a rural community, we use basically the same design criteria, and so that's what we're changing. That's a fundamental change, and will be the first state in the country, as far as I know, that's taken this approach from an agency standpoint. We have significantly enhanced and promoted over the last 6 months the promotion of modern roundabouts. They are a proven measure to improve safety, and I'll talk more about that. Likewise, we have historically allowed local governments to come to us and ask for road diets on the state system. That has always resulted in them taking those corridors over. We're changing that approach. We've developed policies, and so taking the road over will not be an automatic requirement for doing a road diet. We'll be road dieting some of our own corridors. What does that mean? It means taking, for example, a 4-lane roadway down to 2 lanes and then converting that extra space into either on-street parking or bike lanes, depending on the corridor. And then finally, we've got to update our traffic laws. This is the current definition of a crosswalk in our statutes. I'll give you a second to read that. So having read that, is there any wonder why there's confusion in the police agencies, in the public, on what the traffic laws are? I mean, our laws are written such a way that nobody can understand them, including the traffic judge that's on our coalition to help us rewrite the laws. So here's an example of some of the submissions we've made to the statutes during this legislative cycle. Between now and next year, we will have completely written all the laws related to bike and ped to again improve these definitions so that they make sense to the average person in law enforcement and everyone else. Why don't we hold the questions if you don't mind? I suspect that's the goal here. And then, so how do you support that culture change? It's one thing to put policies in place. We have done extensive training. We've already done 1 round of training on all of these courses in our 7 geographic districts. We'll be going out and doing it again this coming year. We've trained literally hundreds of engineers and planners during this past year in preparation for getting this out. And as Tim mentioned earlier, we can do a lot on the engineering side, but we've got to work on education and enforcement because we can't do it with just the one factor. We know statistically that when you combine the 3, you get much greater results. And with our initiatives with Bike Walk Central Florida and the Orlando area, we've seen the results when you combine all 3. It's much more effective. How did we get here? Certainly from a transportation agency, we contributed to this problem with the focus on moving cars. But one of the things that we need from local governments, both cities and counties, as we move forward, is that we need help in changing the way we develop. Because these kinds of land development patterns on the top half of the slide, where you cul-de-sac everything onto the state road and you separate all the uses, forces the roads to be widened over time. Either that or you're going to be completely shut down, which at this point in time our public has not been willing to accept. If you build gridded networks of street, allow uses to be mixed, people may still choose to drive, but then all of your roads are not blown out to 4 and 6 lane roadways. And I'll show you an example of a project in Orlando that has successfully done that. Likewise, if we set all of our retail and destinations back 300 and 400 and 500 feet from the roadway, even though you may have sidewalks and bike lanes and transit, who's going to walk in this environment in Florida? Not during this time of year, obviously, but during the summer. So again, these are things that local governments control. We have no authority over these kinds of decisions or land development patterns. A big challenge is how do we get the speeds down to reduce severity? One of the tools is a modern roundabout. A properly designed modern roundabout will get the speeds down into 18 to 23 miles an hour so that if there is a crash, it will be much less severe, and consequently fatalities will be reduced as well. I'm going to focus on 4 of these 9 proven measures that Federal Highway has published here in the last year. First of all, modern roundabouts and road diets, which I've already mentioned. Here's a good example of a project in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm working with District 5 in the Orlando area. We're doing a study on a state corridor to look at doing something exactly like this. And so there's the after. You can see that the on-street parking has been installed to replace the lanes, travel lanes there, and they have a buffered bike lane, if I remember correctly. They're there. On this slide, talking about mid-block crossings, we've been using mid-block crossings for a while, but historically it's been one of those things that we've put in when we had to because it was the last result or the last way we could effectively deal with a problem. We're taking a much more proactive approach and looking at what are the generators and destinations and where should we putting these in so that they make sense to the pedestrian. When you have signals at 1 mile spacings, you've got to provide intermediate crossings for the pedestrian. So not only will we be using treatments and making them accessible, we'll be putting markings in and using one of these traffic control features, either the rectangular rapid flashing beacon, which the city of St. Pete has had enormous success with on our 4-lane and narrower roadways, or what's called the hawk, which is a signal that creates a stop condition for our 6-lane corridors. We're looking at using both of those more extensively to help make crossings safer for pedestrians. And when I talk about context, I'm talking about, we go from a very rural condition to a very urban condition, and we use the SMART code, which is a non-proprietary planning tool, to define what the context is. This is a tool that many people are familiar with in our profession, and so we're going to define context and then use that as a way to define what type of bike and pedestrian facilities we'll provide. And I'll flip through these fairly quickly. This is to educate the engineers on what context means. We have incorporated a lot of this into our traditional neighborhood development chapter in the Florida Green Book, which cities and counties are required by law to use unless they have their own codes. So I've been pointing this out to our engineers and saying, you don't have to wait until we get this guidance in place a year from now. Much of this has already been produced in the traditional neighborhood development chapter and handbook, which I was the chapter author of, and Alyssa Torres back here was actually helped me tremendously in authoring this document. It's an excellent tool for local governments in doing things different. And we're moving away from picking as high a speed as possible, which was our traditional practice. If we're designing a road that we were going to post at 35, we would design it for 40 or 45 miles an hour. And so I stepped in and said, this makes no sense. It's never made any sense. We're going to design for a target speed, and we're not going to exceed that in our design process. So that's the approach that we'll be going to, basically the top item. So when you look at a road like this, many times we get asked to reduce lane widths. You could take these lanes down to 10 feet and people are not going to drive any slower. The belief is, well, if you'll just reduce the lane widths, then people will drive slow. But if you take a 4-lane road or a 2-lane road and create this condition, now people are going to drive 15 miles an hour because the road feels very different than a conventional suburban type treatment. And in the T&D chapter, we've got a table that shows these kinds of conditions. Basically, in our plans prep manual, which is what our state engineers use, we will have de facto places where we use 10-foot lanes, where we use 11-foot lanes, and we will still have 12-foot lanes, obviously, for high-speed corridors. What we're talking about related to bikes, and these are draft concepts, I repeat, these are draft concepts that we will be working with FBA and other groups, bike ped coordinators throughout the state, to vet out and decide what we use through this context-based approach. But obviously for low-speed, low-volume roads, we'll still be using sharrows such as we already have on the state road system. For moderate speed, and again, all of these are subject to discussion. These are just ideas. Our standard bike lane will be 7 feet. Currently it's 4 feet plus the curb and gutter. It will go to 7 feet. And it'll be a buffered bike lane, which I'll show you here shortly. We're even going to be able to do this on resurfacing projects. And then finally, for our high-speed, high-volume roads, we have some corridors where no one will ride, even with bike lanes on them. So we're going to look at using multi-use paths as a way to accommodate users across the state. So here's an example where we will take a foot out of each lane for the travel lanes, and you can see this one shows a 6-foot bike lane plus the curb and gutter section, whereas usually we would have had 4 feet. This could be done during a resurfacing project. Here's a condition where we take a foot out of each travel lane and make a 7-foot bike lane, buffered bike lane.
With double stripe, right?
With a double stripe, yes. And then obviously getting back to what needs to be done differently if we want complete streets, these are the things that we're looking for local governments to help us out with. Here's a project I send people to from all over the country, honestly, and statewide. This is Baldwin Park in Orlando. It used to be the Naval Training Center. And unlike most developments that you see that might have 1 or 2 connections to the arterial system, this has 32 connections to the adjacent street network. There are no 4-lane roadways in Baldwin Park and no no signalized intersections, despite the fact that they're approaching 14,000 residents. So this is the type of as local governments are looking to redevelop or do new development, this is what we're encouraging them to do, which will take some of the load off the state system. And just some examples of projects that have been done. This is actually a relatively new project in Winter Park. There was a time when we couldn't get chains into these kinds of developments. This is actually in downtown Orlando. It's on the ground floor of a condo building. It's not a standalone Publix, and it has no surface parking lot. It actually shares parking with all the other retail on this street. So this model is something that we can sell to these chains now that we couldn't 10 years ago when I left the state, or 13 years ago when I left the DOT. And I'll show you one example. This is a project I was project manager on in Woodville, south of Tallahassee, and we came up with a plan to show them how they could move away from the suburban development patterns they were on to a pattern that would allow us to reduce the speeds along this corridor. And so over time, this is how Woodville would hopefully become. And with that, now I think we may have time for questions.